Okay, thank you. My name is Ciaran Harman. I'm an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. I want to talk, the talk I want to give today is a little, I guess, more narrowly focused in some ways than the very stimulating talks we've heard earlier in this session. But there is a general point to it that I think echoes what we just heard and also what Jay said in the previous session, in that when we're integrating models together, and each has its own interesting disciplinary questions associated with it, there are interesting fundamental questions and fundamental problems that must be solved at the interface between those models. And then, in fact, fundamental advances in theory and in the mathematical modeling at the interfaces can be very stimulating and very interesting. So what I want to talk about today is a piece of a water sustainability and climate project based at Johns Hopkins, but which has a large number of collaborators across many institutions that is focused very much on the Chesapeake Bay, and in particular on understanding how climate change will affect through all the coupled systems of the Chesapeake Bay, from the, where's that pointer gone? From how farmers make decisions about when to plant crops, what crops to plant, and how much fertilizer to apply and when to apply it, how those changes coupled to concurrent changes in climate will affect watershed processes, and how those those changes will then propagate into the bay. And we're particularly interested in sort of intra-annual, sort of seasonal variability and the timing of events, the timing of the onset of eutrophication events, and long-term behaviour, and then how these things connect to policy scenarios. We have a lot of interaction through this project with government agencies that are very embedded in the Bay, and in particular in the work that I do, thinking about the watershed piece of this, interacting with the Chesapeake Bay program, which is a partnership of many agencies and institutions. One of the main roles of the partnership of this program is to construct and run the Chesapeake Bay watershed model, which is a model that tries to predict and route water and nutrients through the entire Chesapeake Bay watersheds into the bay, predicting the timing of nutrient, sediment, and water exports. That model is embedded in legislation, and it is used to perform various legislative goals, including setting TMDL diets for the watersheds. It's a very sort of typical lumped watershed model, a prototypical watershed model based on HSPF. Each of the 1,000+ sub-watersheds of the model has embedded within it a lumped hydrologic model that has these compartments, these sort of upper soil zone, groundwater zone, each of which has water and nutrients routed through it, and has parameters that must be calibrated associated with that. The program has oversight or received recommendations from scientific and technical advisory committees that push it in different directions about what kind of things ought to be included in the model and how it should be developed further. One of the very important things that Scientific Advisory Council has said is a crucial advance that's required is to incorporate the effects of groundwater lags and groundwater lag times in this model. In the Chesapeake Bay watersheds, about half the water that enters the watersheds is essentially groundwater. It's baseflow. It spent some period of time in the groundwater, and that water contributes about half of the nitrate that ends up in the stream. And that water, much of it is very, very old. Half the water in the Delmarva Peninsula, for instance, is more than 13 years old by the time it reaches the bay. So that has enormous implications for our ability to think about what will be the effect of a particular management action on the future inputs into the bay. I mean, if we take some action now, it may be decades before we see a significant reduction in the amount of nitrate reaching the bay. So a question is, how do we incorporate that? How do we incorporate this long lag times into the model in a way that is both physically justified, but also doesn't require us to rewrite the model from scratch, since this is a huge model that has had input from many, many stakeholders, and it would be infeasible to try to reconstruct it from scratch. There are other models that are looking at these groundwater lag times in a lot of detail. For instance, people at the USGS, particularly Ward Stanford and some colleagues, have been putting together these very detailed mod flow simulations of groundwater transport through pieces of the watershed. They've conducted this on the Delmarva Peninsula, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, and are currently working on the Potomac River Basin and intend to continue to expand this work. This modelling involves, a gridded groundwater transport model, flow and transport model, transport being conducted with particle tracking through the groundwater flow domain at steady state. So this is a steady state groundwater flow model. And you can see that it provides information about how long it takes some recharge that enters the domain at a particular point to enter a stream and eventually into the bay. And you can see that those ages range on the order from 0 to 300 years at the top end there. So, question, how can we take this kind of steady state groundwater model in a gridded domain and plug that into a lumped subwatershed-based daily time step watershed model? How do we make that link? So a useful tool that we could use to do this is the idea of a transit time distribution, which is a distribution of the ages of water leaving a system. Now, to give you a little more detail on that, imagine we have some control volume. It might be a subwatershed, for instance. And within that system, we have parcels of water, each of which has a different age attached to it. And so we can think about the residence time distribution within the system. The inflow entering the system has initially age 0, and after it enters, it displaces some water that is already present, and so we have water leaving that has its own distribution of ages. So that's our outflow transit time distribution. And these transit time distributions are very useful for predicting solute transport if the flow is steady state. So for instance, if we have some age distribution or transit time distribution based on either numerical modeling or some fitted relationship, we can convolve that with some scenario of inputs to the system through a simple convolution to get a time series of outputs from the system. Basically, at each time step, mixing the historical inputs to the system in the past according to that transit time distribution. This is an approach that works very well in groundwater systems, but only in steady flow. In non-steady flows, this simple approach will not work. It won't conserve mass. And I could tell you more about that, but I'm cutting down my time here. There's many sources of time variability in transit time distributions. It's not just the flow. We also have to think about the time variability of the inputs, but also the time variability of the outputs, both of which are driven by the hydrologic system. But there's also changes in the hydrologic pathways in the system over short term and over the long term due to things like land use change. And so ideally, what we would like is some lumped representation of all these things that we can use to incorporate things like land use change and climate change eventually. This is sort of being the big picture. As a step towards that big picture, there is now, based on research from groups in Italy and work that we've been doing at Hopkins, what I would say is a rigorous and convenient theoretical framework that generalizes the idea of a transit time distribution to fully time variable flows and non-stationary transport conditions. It's called the SAS theory, storage selection functions. A storage selection function being the thing you parameterize instead of a transit time distribution. And there's a few flavors of these. The one I want to talk about is based on some work I recently completed and is published in Water Resources Research. And just to give you a taste of what this theory looks like, imagine you take your control system, it has some inputs, such as rainfall or recharge. It has some outputs such as discharge and evapotranspiration. And we can define a new variable, which we call the age rank storage, being the volume of water inside the system that is less than a certain age at a certain time. So right now, inside your watershed, how much water is less than a week old? How much water is less than a month old? This is a variable that we can track in time. Yes. And so imagine when we sort of visualize what we do with that is to say, let's take all the water in your system and arrange it in a vertical column with the youngest water at the top of the column and the oldest water further down. And so when there's precipitation or recharge coming into the system, it's maybe variable in time, that's always going to be entering at the top of the column since it has age 0. The discharge, however, can have a distribution of ages. So you imagine this column has a series of valves coming out the side. If we can describe a distribution of how much water, relatively speaking, is taken from each one of those valves, that defines a sort of a mixing rule that we can then use to determine as a function of time and as a function of what that distribution of ages are in storage, what the transit time distribution therefore looks like and how it varies in time. So, so the shape of this, and I should mention, this function that describes that distribution of how much water, relatively speaking, is taken from each one of these valves is this storage selection function. So that's the thing that we now have to parameterize instead of the transit time distribution. It's a probability distribution of storages, not a probability distribution of times. The shape of that distribution determines the nature of transport in the system. So if we have a uniform distribution, we are taking water in an unbiased way from what's inside the system, that corresponds to a well-mixed sort of system. So well-mixed gives you, at steady state, an exponential transit time distribution, but it gives you a uniform rSAS function. So these are different from each other. So just quickly, in the paper we describe the application to a very well-monitored stream in Wales, where they have this extraordinary data set of 30 years of weekly rainfall and weekly stream flow chloride, and there's no anthropogenic or geogenic sources of chloride in the system, so we can use this as as good as we can get of a conservative tracer. And by calibrating only 3 parameters for this shape of this distribution and how it varies as a function of catchment wetness, we're able to match in a pretty good way the time series of stream flow chloride purely from the rainfall chloride and the hydrologic balance from timescales of days to decades. So if we look at it in a frequency domain, we actually match the behavior all across the frequency spectrum. So how do we apply that in the Chesapeake Bay? So the idea is therefore to take the output from this modflow, modpath model of, say, the Delmarva Peninsula, and for each one of the model, the watershed model sub-watersheds, determine what is the transit time distribution from each of the grid cells in there to the nearest stream. And so we can actually get that transit time distribution. And then under the assumption of the steady state flow, we can convert that into an equivalent rSAS function. So this is the equivalent storage selection function that at steady flow would give you that transit time distribution. And then we make the assumption that even though recharge is varying in time, the rSAS function doesn't vary nearly as much. So you can have, if your system is well mixed, it's still well mixed. So then we can parameterize the shape of that rSAS function and then use that with the time variable recharge that comes out of the watershed model and the time variable concentrations that come out of that watershed model to route that through each one of the sub-watersheds to produce the stream nitrate concentrations. So we've been doing this now. This is what the rSAS functions look like for all of these, I think, 262 sub-watersheds in the Delmarva Peninsula. They give us a distribution of sort of means of those distributions. So these are sort of a mean depth of storage that's participating in transport, and they're sort of on the order of hundreds of inches, which is about what we would expect. And they also correspond spatially with sort of the distribution of geologic structures inside the peninsula. You can sort of see patterns there. Just to give you a quick example, one little watershed up on the coastal side of the Delmarva might have a certain recharge flux coming out of the soil zone and into the groundwater, and you can see that on the top there, very variable in time. It has a baseflow flux coming out that varies more on a seasonal timescale, and we can route different scenarios of nutrients moving into that system and out again. So the blue here being steady recharge, a steady concentration of annual sort of pulsed inputs. And if we had a step change of a reduction of 75% in the red there, you can see how long that step change takes in the order of, so I think that happened in about 1989. This is just a purely hypothetical scenario. You haven't even seen probably half of the ultimate change that you would get by the time you get to this year. So the conclusion really is just that this is an example of where a fundamental theoretical advance was needed to provide a bridge between models operating at different scales, in this case different spatial scales and different temporal scales. The theoretical advance in this case was this idea of a storage selection function, which generalizes the idea of a transit time distribution. And the bridge, this was able to bridge models between distributed groundwater and lumped catchment modeling. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.